Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we start a new series on the colonies during the English Civil War. And the English Civil War was an interesting, tumultuous time in the 1640s, and we're going to learn in this series that different colonies had different reactions to the English Civil War. Some colonies fared far better than others, and so we'll start today's episode in the spring of 1640. And after 1 decade of sole rule in England in 1640, Charles I summoned a parliament. The main driver behind his decision to do this was that a war had erupted with Scotland and the country needed to raise funds, and he was unable to do that without a legislative branch. The Parliament only sat for 3 weeks because they refused to impose taxes without addressing the royal abuses that they felt had been suffered upon them. The rifts in England were becoming very, very apparent now, and it was looking like essentially one branch of government was at a totally different area in how the country should be run versus another branch of government. After a brief war and subsequent peace with Scotland, Charles I reconvened Parliament in November of 1640 to address the costs of the war. A key member of what would later be referred to as the Long Parliament was Henry Vane the Younger. And you may remember him because he is the former governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Parliament would pass the Triennial Act in early 1641 that required Parliament to meet for 50 days every 3 years, thus ending the possibility of a lengthy monarch rule without the legislative branch of government there in England. Now, over to the colonies in 1640, Virginia was fresh off of its contentious second term of Sir John Harvey, and you can remember that was several weeks ago that we talked about Sir John Harvey, and it ended with his assets being seized and him leaving the colony for England. Sir Francis Wyatt, a familiar name as well to the podcast, was named governor in his place. And the historical record is actually a little unclear as to whether Wyatt was the acting governor at the time or permanent governor. But it appears he was only to serve in that capacity until King Charles I named a replacement. According to historian Wilcom Washburn, Harvey returned to England to find his name being slandered by Anthony Panton. And Anthony Panton, if you'll recall from the Sir John Harvey episodes of the podcast, was a priest whose assets had been confiscated by Harvey, and he was expelled from Virginia during his term. And that actually served as an ignition point for Harvey's disposal as governor. Anthony Panton would not settle for not only Sir John Harvey, but his replacement when the Crown named William Berkeley as royal governor in place of John Harvey and Francis Wyatt. Panton contested his appointment, and the hearings in England would delay Berkeley's exit to Virginia, which allowed Francis Wyatt to serve for 15 months, so it took a little while for William Berkeley to come over from England. The quarter court in Virginia was busy in 1640 with plenty of small claim lawsuits and tons of disputes going on between individual parties. In June of 1640, several complaints began coming to the quarter court of servants fleeing their plantations and going to Maryland. And a group of men was actually formed with the consent of the government to go and find these men. And if you'll recall from previous programs here, previous episodes, Maryland offered an indentured servitude program that was friendlier than any of the other colonies. So for indentured servants to flee Virginia and go to Maryland was likely a natural reaction of that more favorable program. But this group of men is formed to go and find these individuals and return them. Let's have a look at the writing. The court hath granted that a commission shall be drawn for John Mottram and Edward Fleet, authorizing them to levy a party of men, or more if need require, and of the hands bound up for Charles River County with arms and ammunition, to go in pursuit of certain runaway Negroes, and to bring them in to the governor. So, in this case, this is likely the first slave hunting group that we actually come across in American history, and it was in 1640 Virginia. And while it appears that this is, the first slave hunters group, the results actually show through their work that they may have been bringing in more than just slaves. For example, let's look at the writing to see what happened on July 9th, 1640. Whereas Hugh Gwynn hath, by order from this board, brought back from Maryland 3 servants formerly run away from the said Gwynn, the court doth therefore order that the said 3 servants shall receive the punishment of whipping, and to have 30 stripes apiece. One called Victor, a Dutchman, the other a Scotchman called James Gregory, shall first serve out their times with their master according to their indentures, and 1 whole year apiece after the time of their services expired, by their said indentures in recompense of his loss sustained by their absence. And after that service to their said master is expired, they're to serve the colony for 3 whole years apiece, and that the third, being a Negro named John Punch, shall serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life here or elsewhere. So there you see a distinction between the indentured servants and the slaves coming over from Africa. John Punch is the first known individual that I could find who's required to work for life in the colonies. And if anybody out there has any other information about that, I would be happy to look over it. But it's a precedent in terms of the distinction between indentured servants and slaves in terms of their timing. Up to this point, we had seen slaves from Africa being freed, being treated as indentured servants. We saw that in a Maryland episode as well. So John Punch represents the first person who is sentenced to the traditional form of slavery that we're used to seeing, and that would obviously spread over time across the American South and Southeast. The number of escapes of both indentured servants and slaves continued to be a problem into the fall of 1640. In October, the quarter court ordered several indentured servants whipped and branded for conspiring to escape. Also, 2 freemen named John Tompkinson and Richard West were ordered whipped and entered into 2 years indentured servitude for concealing the plot. Perhaps these 2 men, Tompkinson and Richard West, were the first documented abolitionists in colonial America. It's hard to say, but their punishment was that they were no longer free men. So Virginia is not concerned, nor should they be yet, of the events of England. At the same time all this is going on in Maryland, there wasn't a concern for England or that of indentured servants escaping. The General Assembly met in 1640, and they actually required a seal be placed on all exported tobacco. This is likely designed to reduce smuggling of the commodity. all of this would change in 1641 when the General Assembly passed an Act Against Fugitives. That's what the law was called, an Act Against Fugitives. The act criminalized any servants fleeing along with anyone aiding or abetting the actions, with penalties up to death. So Maryland is seeing the same problem. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts Bay, which is being run by Puritans, Thomas Dudley returns as the colony's governor in 1640. The new governor almost immediately receives letters of complaint from Willem Kieft, who was the governor of New Netherland, and he is dissatisfied with the English presence in Connecticut. While the Pequots are no longer a threat to the colonists, the overall native threat in the area remained real. Rumors of the Narragansetts threatening English colonists began to fuel throughout the colony. William Bradford in Plymouth wrote to the Massachusetts Bay with the same fear, along with Connecticut Governor John Haynes. So this same issue that we saw stirring up before, where there were natives and Dutch and English in Connecticut and it was getting people worried, it's stirring up again, only in Connecticut they're afraid of the Dutch and the Narragansett. In Massachusetts, I think they're more afraid of the Narragansett because the Narragansett are occupying modern-day Rhode Island. Apparently, the Narragansetts, as it turns out, had approached the Mohawks about allying against the English. So more geopolitical instability, if you will, occurring in New England in 1640. In late 1640, and we touched on this last week, a collapse of prices brought economic problems to the colony. Corn was selling at 3 shillings a bushel, which it was usually 4 or 5, and other commodity prices dropped as well. Winthrop, in his writing, notes, quote, "A fear of want of foreign commodities. Now our money was gone." And so it sounds like some sort of economic collapse had occurred. It could have been related to the English-Scottish War. Remember, the king needed money. So the colony had to pivot, and that's the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they pivoted by building ships and paying the shipbuilders what they could, when they could. In Plymouth, the plummet in the price of cattle negatively impacted the colony, making it less affluent, according to William Bradford. In 1642, after years of dispute, the Plymouth colonists settled their trade dispute with London merchants. It was the single most covered, and I might add tediously covered, event mentioned in the 35-year span of William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. For the Massachusetts Bay Colony, this is the first time we see this, the colony weighs in on the calling of Parliament, and to them it offered hope. Let's have a look at the writing. Upon the great liberty which the king had left the Parliament to in England, some of our friends there wrote to us advice to send over some to solicit for us in the Parliament, giving us hope that we may obtain much. Now Winthrop goes on to mention, but consulting about it, we decline the motion for this consideration, that if we should put ourselves under the protection of the Parliament, we must then be subject to all such laws as they should make, or at least such as they might impose upon us. So they thought about it. They thought about going to Parliament. They thought about being a part of the Puritan Parliament, or the Roundheads as they were called, in England, but they thought, do we really want to come under their rule? Remember now, they've been gone for more than a decade. John Winthrop, in this case, gone more than 12 years. They're not probably 100% sure what's going on over there, although they've got friends in high places. After even further consideration, the Puritans decide to send a delegation to England to try to get access to West Indies cotton. Richard Bellingham would become the 8th governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1641. He defeated John Winthrop in the voting after fear arose that Winthrop would serve for life. Governor Bellingham doesn't sound like a name many people may think is familiar or are not sure of, but he would become the symbol of civil authority in Nathaniel Hawthorne's book, The Scarlet Letter. So Governor Bellingham, same person as the Bellingham in Nathaniel Hawthorne's book, The Scarlet Letter. Meanwhile, tensions in England continued to rise as Thomas Wentworth, the first Earl of Strafford, was executed by the order of Parliament and the reluctant consent of King Charles I. So think of that. Thomas Wentworth, a very high-ranking official, allied with King Charles I, not seen highly by Parliament, is executed. Winthrop, in his writings, mentions him as, quote, our great enemy. And he went on to call the situation, and I quote, our great success there. So clearly, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is feeling good about the events going on in England. In late 1641, the General Court established the Body of Liberties. These were 98 laws that represented the beginnings of self-governance in America. The Body of Liberties reads like a primitive Bill of Rights, which is still 150 years away. For example of some of these things in the Body of Liberties, no man shall be pressed into any office, work, wars, or other public service. So it sounds like no draft, essentially. No man's cattle or goods shall be pressed or taken for public use. That's interesting. That is a very early version of the Fourth Amendment. Every man shall have the liberty of attending any public court. No man shall be taxed for estate or revenue in England. That's interesting. Free fishing and fowling, essentially declaring unowned lands public. So Massachusetts Bay, while tensions are flaring and their allies are rising to power at home, they're providing this body of liberties to their people in the colony. Charles I would end up fleeing London as the year 1641 draws to a close, and the parliaments of both England and Scotland would raise armies in opposition to him. The English Civil War was about to erupt into a full-blown conflict, and we will continue with that discussion next time on Historical Context.